I brought a prop. Just to give you a sense of, I did a close read of this when I was Jeff's doctoral student. So there you go. So it's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for the welcome and the invitation. And Jeff, thank you for the guidance over the years. It was 10 years, by the way. So it's a very long time. I was here so long that at one point a dean came into the lounge where I was waiting to meet with Jeff, and he said, "Wow, are you still here?" I thought that's not a good sign, but start with a quick framing. Sometime in mid-2006, as I was just about to give up on finding a doctoral program to study the things I thought I wanted to study in ways I thought I wanted to study them, I found myself sitting in Jeff's office at the New School for the first time. He asked me about myself, my work, and my interests. And I explained that I had just spent nearly 2 decades working on and in intractable, often violent conflict. And I wanted to better understand what made these conflicts particularly toxic and total. And he said kindly, "You know, there's already plenty of scholarship on that question. That's a very well-paved road in sociology, and sure, you can study that more if you really want to." I felt this wasn't going very well. However, Jeff kept talking, saying, "But you said you have all of these experiences." I had worked in Iraq and Northern Ireland, in Burma and Kosovo and East Timor, Palestine and Israel. And he said, in doing that work, I'm guessing you've seen some pretty interesting things. And I responded that in fact I had. Had I though, it all seemed fairly mundane and I felt like I was grasping for something here. And he pressed me to say something, and I talked about the one thing I had wondered about sometimes, the often strident and very risky efforts that people off of the center stage in conflict sometimes make to reach across to the enemy. These groups and these actions, these interactions, were seriously against the grain of conflict. They were often put together by scrappy groups with little resources, and their activities stayed in my memory as oddities long after a given United Nations project had concluded. He seemed interested, but I said these things always show up in ways that are just impossibly small. That was it. Jeff lit up saying, "Okay, now we're talking about something real." I was quite surprised, but I explained that this really isn't where the action is when it comes to building peace, that the UN, states, and other international actors and hegemons, power wielders, are trying and often failing. So these small efforts are marginal at best and fairly naive. Jeff smiled before launching into the best synthesis I've ever heard, even yet, of Arendt, Goffman, Foucault, and Havel. Then he said, "Tell me a story about a time when you saw this happen." And here's the story I shared with Jeff. In 2005, I co-led a training and a dialogue on peacebuilding with a group of Iraqis involved in economic and political development. The participants shared some goals, but the stratifications within the group were also significant and quite evident. The group was reflective of Iraq's demographic and political diversity, involving Kurds, Shia, Sunni, Christians, Turkmen, and Yazidi. This brought both richness and challenges. The facilitating method that we used in this particular initiative allows participants a great deal of freedom during the process. And I watched as small groups engaged, discussed, debated, and planned action. Participants moved freely and chaotically from group to group, often appearing to exit the formal process altogether. People drank tea, smoked a lot of cigarettes in the garden, and ate together. To a great degree, they met as equals. Much of the interaction appeared fairly unrelated to the task that we as international interveners had given them. At one point, one Iraqi colleague gently suggested that I should try to bring some order back to the apparent chaotic scene. And for better or for worse, I chose not to. I don't think I could have anyway. In the closing session, each participant reflected on the experience as they passed a branch from an olive tree that we had cut in the garden around the circle. When this olive branch reached a young woman from the Iraqi minority Turkmen community, she began speaking in the Turkmen language rather than in Arabic or Kurdish, the two official, dominant, and politically powerful languages of the country. Suddenly, an older Sunni Arab man interrupted loudly, scolding her viciously for not speaking in Arabic. Earlier in the program, during a robust dialogue regarding approaches that might be taken to address endemic conflicts in Iraq, this same man had stood in the doorway smoking furiously and shouted at us, "More power, what we need is more power." This man came from Bakuba, a city that had seen intense violence. Now in the circle, he was shouting directly at this woman, "Iraqis speak Arabic. Why are you here if you are not a real Iraqi? Speak in Arabic." The woman stared straight ahead, silent and unsure of what to do. I reminded the man that we had agreed to allow people to speak in any language and asked him gently not to interrupt. The man scowled at me and at the woman, and she quietly finished her comments. When the olive branch reached the man, he started to say the foundational Muslim blessing often invoked at important moments. He started with, "In the name of God, most gracious, most compassionate," and after several words, he faltered and stopped. Others prompted him with the next words of the blessing, but he held up his hand for silence. Then he started to weep, unable to complete his thoughts. He passed the olive branch to the next participant. This was all fairly intense, but we continued on. At the conclusion of the event, one participant complained that we had not really taught the group about democracy, which had been one of their objectives. Before I could respond and defend our work, the angry man who had interrupted earlier spoke up again. I was a bit concerned. He disagreed strongly with the criticism of our time together, which utterly surprised me. He insisted vociferously that the group had, in fact, in his words, truly practiced democracy because we were allowed, encouraged, and guided to speak in our mother tongue and say what we needed to say to each other as equals. Others agreed, and the mood shifted to a sense of joy and unity and optimism, a marked distinction from where we had started with tension and polarization. In this intense interaction, we see the full expression of Jeff's politics of small things. The group met and spoke more or less as equals for those days. They shared facts and truths grounded in a pluralistic local realities from all over Iraq. The emphasis was on the unique issues of each region, the development, the political, and the social challenges, and innovative ideas emerged. These facts and the mode of interaction was starkly at odds with the ideologies of the previous regime and the state and non-state hegemons who were constantly reinforcing and policing polarization, intractability, and violence outside of that garden space. Their facts were also at odds with the violent regime change brought by the American invasion and occupation. They diverged from the neoliberal state-building ideology of the Coalition Provisional Authority, the American administration of Iraq that implemented privatization, badly conceived and executed de-Baathification and other wrong-headed policies in the country. The group spoke and acted in ways that subverted that polarization, those ideologies, and the hierarchies of the intractable conflict landscape. I find Jeff's analysis, oddly, of Polish underground theater in the 1970s incredibly useful for understanding Iraq in 2005. He notes that people met and acted together, defining and defending freedom by constituting definitions of social situations in which frames were related in ways that ran counter to the existing order. And that's what I was seeing in that room. Elaborating and elevating concepts drawn from Goffman, Arendt, and Foucault, Goldfarb's Politics of Small Things shows us how networks of people constituting transformed social definitions of the situation politically create a democratic alternative to totalitarianism. In that interaction that I've described, I see those exact same political powers to resist, define, and create. His politics of small things is at the center of this story, but it's also at the center of thousands of efforts around the globe in which small groups interacting against the grain of conflict are generating a unique form of political power that I've come to call the intimacy of enemies. In fact, only these small local groups are capable of creating and harnessing this specific form of political power, which is so at odds to the prevailing conflict landscape. Therefore, these groups are the most potent agents to offer alternatives to this kind of conflict. Understanding the intimacy of enemies is the key to inverting centuries of reliance on actors and approaches that simply aren't working. I've identified a few attributes that I'd like to share with you in terms of what's happening in the intimacy of enemies. And I'll give a quick summary herein and try to connect it directly to what I see in Jeff's work. The very first and most significant is that these groups work to resist conflict and redefine the situation, a phrase that comes up over and over in the politics of small things. They establish their own norms and their own forms of equitable interaction, as the Turkmen woman did by using her mother tongue against the grain of Arabic and Kurdish that was the norm in that moment. They wrestled with this new way of being, as the angry man did in his interruption, followed by his later acceptance and affirmation. They enacted new norms. They spent time together. They created a new definition of the situation. This activates and unleashes a sense of freedom and agency in a totalitarian landscape. Ultimately, they created alternatives. This, for Jeff, is the essence of the politics of small things, where it becomes consequential. I have to say that through my years of research, as I worked on these themes and these stories that Jeff kept encouraging me to write about, I had a secret nagging feeling that none of this mattered. The intimacy of enemies still felt inconsequential until I revisited this book about 15 years later, just now. Jeff writes, "It is the interaction among people and in their capacity to redefine the situation and to act in concert that alternatives will be realized." And then the line that filled me finally with hope: "It is the form of the constitution of their power that is central, not their achievement of their particular ends. Indeed, this is the power of the powerless in dark times." Thank you, Jeff, for illuminating so much for us.